Okay, so in this video, we are going to be looking at two things. The first is parenting styles, and then we'll look at temperament. So first of all, starting with parenting styles, we're going to be looking at the four parenting styles that were proposed by a psychologist named Boehmerin in 1971. And so what you have here on so these are divided into these four sections. On the x-axis, we have behavioral control and demandingness. So basically how controlling they are of the child's behavior, how many rules they set, how strict they are with those rules. And then on the y-axis, we have their level of responsiveness to the child's needs, and then how warm and supportive they are. So I want to start with authoritative parenting, because research actually shows that this is the most successful parenting style. You find that children show many more positive outcomes when this parenting style is used. And by that, I mean you tend to see higher self-esteem, they're more self-reliant, tend to have higher competence in general. So yes, of all the four, this is associated with the most positive outcomes. And what you have here is a parenting style that is very high in behavioral control and demandingness. It's also very high in warmth, supportiveness, and responsiveness. So these are parents that do set rules and guidelines, but they are going to be flexible with those. So although they set them, they adapt as needed. They also tend to set very reasonable expectations, and they will explain why they have those expectations or why they are setting the rules that they are. They are very consistent with the rules and the standards that they set. They're also very responsive to their child's needs. They listen to them. They respond as needed. They offer support. They are very warm and affectionate. And so with this combination of setting guidelines, creating a structure for them, being supportive, being loving, affectionate, this combination, you see higher self-esteem and those things that I mentioned. Moving on to authoritarian. Now, this is similar in that you see a high level of behavioral control and demandingness, but this is on a different level. They are setting rules and guidelines, but they are extremely strict with those. They're not as flexible as the authoritative parenting style. They're very rigid with those rules. They basically are parents that place very high value on conformity and obedience. So they're the kind of parents that if a child says, well, why have I got to do this, or why are you doing that? It's, well, I'm the adult because I said so. They are very unresponsive to the child's needs. They are also more likely to rely on discipline to enforce the rules that they are setting. Not necessarily physical, it may be, but just in general, there's this higher tendency to use punishment in response to them breaking the rules, or just in general. Permissive parenting style. So these are parents that make very few demands. They're very low on behavioral control. They kind of let the child do whatever they want. But they're also very warm and supportive and responsive to the child's needs, almost too far. They're the kind of parents that will give in very easily. So pretty much, anything goes kind of attitude. They're not setting any guidelines, so the child can pretty much get away with whatever they want. They overindulge them. You kind of think of the relationship more like two friends than a parent-child relationship. And then we have finally the uninvolved parenting style. This is also sometimes called the neglectful parenting style. These are parents that are they're indifferent, they're not involved. They don't really make any demands, but the difference here in the permissive parenting style, they're not really making any demands because they're so loving, they just don't expect anything. They just want to do everything to please the child and don't expect anything of them. Whereas with the uninvolved parents, it's that they just don't care. They're not setting any rules or any guidelines. They're not creating any structure because they're either they don't care, or maybe it's that they're not around to do that. Quite often this is when parents are absent, or not around a lot. And so they're also very unresponsive to the child's needs. They're more likely to be cold, unsupportive, um, and uninterested in their child overall. Now, normally I would discuss the types of personality traits and behavioral problems that you might see connected to each of these parenting styles, but that is what I want you to do for your activity this week. But what I will mention is, obviously, the type of response that a parent has to their child is going to also largely depend on the child itself and the child's personality, which brings me to temperament. Now, as adults, we talk about people having different personalities. However, when we're referring to infants or babies, we use the word temperament. They haven't quite developed a personality yet, but very early on, you can see these differences in the way that infants are. So you can kind of think of temperament as the how of behavior. It's the way that a child typically behaves and reacts to situations. It's their characteristic style of behavior or disposition. Now, there are three main ways that a child's temperament can be classified. Give me 1 second while I drink some water. Okay, so they are easy, difficult, and slow to warm up. Now, they're pretty self-explanatory in that easy infants are, they're the easy babies. They're the ones that show a lot more positive emotions. They tend to adapt fairly well to change. They're capable of regulating their emotions. And so by that, I mean, if they start crying or they get distressed about something, they're fairly easily soothed, or they calm down quite quickly. They're also pretty quick to develop a regular sleeping and feeding schedule. So just in general, they are easy. Then we have difficult temperament. So these are pretty much the opposites. These are the babies that show a lot more negative emotions. They have a harder time adapting to change and regulating their emotions. So when they come up upset or distressed, they are much harder to soothe. They tend to be more irritable and fussy, and they also have a harder time establishing a regular sleeping and feeding schedule. Now, obviously, I'll get to slow to warm up in a second, but obviously having an easy child versus a difficult child is going to change how you respond to them. When you have an easy child, of course, it's much easier to be warm and responsive to their needs. And so what you tend to see is that babies with an easy temperament tend to elicit more warm and responsive parenting. On the other hand, if you have an extremely difficult child, it may be much harder to stay calm and to remain patient. And so these are babies that are more likely to evoke irritation, and they may cause the parents to withdraw or kind of pull back a little bit. Doesn't mean that parents will, but you might see that in response. Then finally, we have slow to warm up. So you can kind of think of this as just being shy. These are babies with much lower activity levels, so they're not quite as quick to go and explore their surroundings. They're obviously going to be a little bit more likely to stay near mum or dad. They will avoid novel stimuli. So if you present them with new things, they're less likely to explore. They're not quite sure, so they'll avoid it. They take time to adjust. They will, but they take a little bit longer. They're also more likely to withdraw or to become distressed in response to unfamiliar stimuli. Maybe not quite to the extent that a baby with a difficult temperament might, but you'll see some mild distress in response to new things. Just for example, look at how babies respond when they meet a new person. You tend to see babies are either, super cheerful and happy regardless of who you pass them over to. You get babies that will start kicking and screaming as soon as you try to pass them over to someone else. And you have those where they're just not sure. They're not, maybe they just look a little uncertain. Maybe they cry a little bit, but they eventually calm down pretty quickly. So these are our shy, slow to warm up babies. Now, temperament is what eventually evolves into our personality. And so, what research shows is that temperament can actually predict how well adjusted people are later in life. So, what you tend to see is that babies with an easy temperament tend to be much better adjusted later in life. They interact more effectively with other people, they cooperate better with their peers. And then on the other hand, you've got your fussier or your more difficult infants who tend to have more conduct problems, so more behavioral problems and kind of acting out, especially boys. You might also see more aggression in these children, but it really comes down to how the parents respond. In that, if you have parents that are very responsive and sensitive to the child's needs, you are less likely to see some of these problematic behaviors. And then finally, slow to warm up. As expected, these are babies that as adults are usually shy. But in addition to that, you also see higher levels of anxiety and depression. Now, this doesn't mean that if, as a baby, you were any of these, or you have a baby with any of these, that they are necessarily going to turn out that way. But research is suggesting that temperament does help to predict how a person turns out, or how well adjusted they are later in life. Obviously, there are many other factors that go into that, but temperament is one of them.